Hey, hello everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and also wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing on autoencoders for particle accelerators over the past year or so. I understand that particle accelerators are kind of outside of the sort of normal scope of work that a lot of you are involved with, but my hope is that today I can sort of share some of the work we've been doing on machine learning, specifically in the area of autoencoders, and maybe that will inspire some of you to do some research in this area and sort of explore the opportunities in this space. So the first thing I want to talk about is what exactly is an autoencoder. And I think that I'll go through some background on autoencoders, and then I'll talk about some specific applications that we've been interested in for anomaly detection and how we've been applying autoencoders for anomaly detection, specifically in particle accelerators. So in simple terms, an autoencoder is a neural network. The main idea is that you are trying to reduce the dimensionality of a given data set to some sort of lower order representation, and then you want to reconstruct that data set using the decoder. So in the simplest type of autoencoder is a feed-forward neural network, a fully connected neural network where you have some input layers, and then you reduce the number of nodes per layer down to what we refer to as the latent space. And that reduction is called the encoder. And then you reconstruct the data back to the sort of the input dimensional space, and that's the decoder. And normally these are symmetric. You can, of course, do some other things with the geometry of the topology of the network. And you can also apply this using all types of different neural network structures. So you can use convolutional neural networks for autoencoders. You can use LSTMs for autoencoders. It's not limited to feed-forward neural networks. It's just a general term that describes a neural network that basically reconstructs a data set. So essentially it's performing an identity transformation while simultaneously reducing the dimensionality of your data set. So there's sort of three kind of common use cases for autoencoders. The first one is feature extraction, and the feature extraction is sort of broken down into two subsets. So the one sort of feature extraction method that you can use is to train the autoencoder on your data set and then look at the output of the latent space. So once the neural network is trained and you have all of your weights, you can then cut off the decoder and just output the data at the latent space and then analyze that data set. So you can use clustering on the latent space. You can use that as an input to another neural network just to sort of understand a lower dimensional space of your data set. And then the other method of feature extraction is to take the output of the latent space and then feed that into a neural network model or another neural network model. So you're basically simplifying the number of data points that you're using to train your model. So if you have a very high dimensional space of inputs and a high dimensional space of outputs, then you can use an autoencoder to reduce the dimensionality of either your input space or your output space or both, and then take the output of your latent space and then feed that into a neural network model that you would use for training. Or that would give you some prediction of some, whether it be a forecasting or whether it be just some physics model or whether it's any kind of empirical model. This is a method for reducing the dimensionality of your data set prior to training your neural network model. And then the other method, the other sort of application of autoencoders is doing what I refer to as a reconstruction test. And essentially the idea here is to train an autoencoder to understand how to reduce the dimensionality of some large data set. And then you say, okay, now we're going to start testing it on unknown data and evaluate the validity of the reconstruction based on the reconstruction error. Since the autoencoder is not learning a mapping between inputs and outputs, it's learning how to reconstruct a set of inputs. You basically always can calculate the error of your reconstruction because you have the inputs. There's no, the inputs are your ground truth. So if you say train an autoencoder on a bunch of good data or a bunch of sort of well-characterized data, and then you test it on new data as it comes in, you can basically have a measure of how similar your new data is to your old data set. And this is one of the primary uses for autoencoders for anomaly detection. And this is actually what when the credit card industry started looking at autoencoders for anomaly detection, this is the technique that they were using, is sort of, you have a lot of good transactions for a given person, and then you say, start testing the autoencoder on new transactions, and then when the reconstruction fails, then you know that transaction is considered anomalous, and then you can flag it as potentially fraudulent, and then ask the user if is this fraudulent or not, and then you can use that to then update your data going forward. So it's a very effective technique for identifying sort of different data from a known data set. I wanted to quickly highlight that there's quite a lot of work going on in the autoencoders, applying autoencoders for atmospheric science. I did just a cursory search, and I found a number of papers. These, I think, were some of the ones that were more interesting. One of the big areas is in just understanding pollution maps and using autoencoders through dimensionality reduction for training machine learning models to understand pollution maps. And there's also a couple that were looking at sort of susceptibility of flood assessments and things like that, and then weather forecasting. But there's a fair amount of work going on for using autoencoders in atmospheric science, and I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff to look into here. But my main interest is in applying them for particle accelerators. So usually we think about particle accelerators in three kind of primary modes of operation. There's accelerator R&D, which is when you're using the machine to understand how to make improvements to the machine. So doing studies, and then in some cases, there are specialized facilities that are built just for the purposes of doing accelerator R&D. And then there's sort of the beam to experimentalists. This is if you have material science or biological experiment that you're trying to run at X-ray user facility, or you have these large experimental collaborations, such as like the Large Hadron Collider, where you're running large physics experiments, and with the Atlas detector and things like that. These are sort of beam delivery to the experimentalist, which is the primary use of a lot of these large facilities. And then there's downtime. And downtime falls into the sort of scheduled maintenance category and the unscheduled maintenance category. And generally the impetus for anomaly detection is trying to minimize the unscheduled maintenance category and take unscheduled maintenance and move it into the scheduled maintenance. So if you can forecast when anomalies will occur, then you can say, okay, we're going to have a failure in this power supply at this time, or we think we're going to have a failure, then maybe you can replace it ahead of time and minimize the amount of unscheduled maintenance that you're doing on the machine. So to look at this, I took a two case study approach. The first case study approach is looking at autoencoders on the Fermilab low energy LINAC, and I'll provide some context for what that means in terms of the Fermilab accelerator complex. This was just a sort of a starting point because it's a simpler problem. There's only 10 input parameters. It's not a very high dimensional space. And it was just a way to sort of get familiar with the tools and study how to use autoencoders in this particular context. And then for the other case, this is trying to understand if magnet power supplies will fail in the APS storage ring. The APS storage ring is a light source based outside of Chicago, and it's a much larger facility than the LINAC at Fermilab. It has 1,300 or so magnets, and the dimensionality of the space is much higher, so it's a little bit more complicated to analyze. Okay, so the Fermilab LINAC case study is focused on understanding these, the root cause. It's a root cause analysis problem for this particular data set. So the LINAC itself is broken down into 4 accelerating stages. So there's the ion source where the H- beam is generated, and then that's accelerated and bunched with what's called the radio frequency quadrupole. And then there's what's called the drift tube LINAC, which accelerates it. That's the first stage of acceleration that gets it about 100 MeV or so. And then the second stage of acceleration gets it to 400 MeV, which is high enough energy to inject into the next accelerator stage. So as you can see on the left here, the accelerator complex itself is comprised of a number of different smaller accelerators. So there's the LINAC, the booster ring, which is its own particle accelerator, and then there's a number of beam transfer lines. the main injector accelerates the beam even further, and inside that ring, there's actually 2 different accelerators. So you can see it's kind of, there's quite a lot going on inside the complex, and we're just looking at a small subset of it. So every year they shut the machine down for summer maintenance, and then they turn it back on in the fall. And usually the machine goes through a period of tune-up. So that's the first part of the data set. And then there's, in this particular case, there was a period of stable operation, which lasted about 10 weeks or so. And then there's a reduced output period where for the last 5 to 7 weeks, the output of the LINAC was not performing at this as well as it had been during the previous 10-week period. And usually the LINAC is supplying beam to the entire accelerator complex. So its main job is to just deliver current. And if the current goes down, then that means that the rest of the accelerator complex is not performing as well as it should be. So that's what we want to understand is, can we use autoencoders to characterize what caused this reduced output, or what caused this shift in the machine operating point in the LINAC during this period? So zooming in just a little bit. So this is we're sort of ignoring the tune-up stage. We're just looking at the stable operation stage and then the reduced output stage. And we're interested in understanding where this change in the beam current came from. And in general, the LINAC doesn't have that many controllable parameters. They're RF cavities that accelerate the beam, and they have amplitude and phase settings that can be changed. And that's pretty much it. For the first stage of the accelerator, there's 5 RF cavities, there's 5 amplitude and phase measurements, and those are the settings that you can vary. So the question is, is the change in the beam current coming from changes in the RF settings, or is it coming from somewhere else? And the RF settings, if we just look at them on the right here, visually, there are some changes in the RF settings, but it's hard to draw a direct correlation from this 10 parameter data set to the change in the beam current. And even just visually, you see there are it's sort of consistent at one value for the first several weeks, and then there's a change, and then there's some other change, and this is all more or less hand tuning, and it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where those changes come from. So this is where we're going to apply the autoencoder. We looked at 2 different cases, and the idea is to say, okay, if we have a set of data during the period of operation that we know is good, and we train the autoencoder on that period of operation, and then we test the autoencoder on the period of operation that we're not so sure about, we should see a change in the reconstruction error that may be correlated with the change in current. And if there is a change that's correlated, then that's suggestive that there's a change in the RF that's fundamental to the output of the beam current for that operating period. And for the purposes of experimenting, we broke this down into 2 different case studies. One case study where we had a very short period of training and validation and just tested on the last 10 weeks. And then the second case study, we had training and validation during the first 10 weeks, and then we tested on the last 5 weeks. And the reason for doing this is just because you may be in a situation where you say, oh, well, we're only certain about data during this region, and we're uncertain about data during this other region, a much larger period. And we want to just compare how much data is necessary for training and how much variation do we need to have in these RF parameters to have a well-trained autoencoder. So because the first thing when just trying to study the autoencoders is saying how many nodes do we need in the encoder dimension. And in general, there's not like a good rule of thumb for this. If you have the same number of encoder dimensions as you have input dimensions, you no longer have an autoencoder because you haven't reduced the dimensionality at all. And that can just be represented as an identity transformation essentially. So there's no information to be learned there. So at a minimum, you need to have fewer encoder dimensions than you have input dimensions. And then from there, if you're looking at a reconstruction test, the output is a single scalar parameter. So having increasing the number of nodes doesn't really increase the complexity of the output space. So here we're just looking at, as we increase the number of nodes, do we start to see overfitting? And we'll pick the minimum number of nodes or the maximum number of nodes before we see any overfitting. as sort of the architecture that we're going to use for the autoencoder. So for the first case, we have the data is trained on the first 5 weeks of data and then tested on the last 10 weeks. And you can see that on the right, this is the RMS reconstruction error for each of the 4 network architectures. And in general, as you increase the number of encoded dimensions, the spread, the variance in the validation set goes down. So it's a pretty good variance in the RMS and the reconstruction error during these first 5 weeks for 2 encoded nodes. When you go to 4 encoded nodes, that variance goes down quite a bit. But in all 4 cases, the offset in the reconstruction error at the end of the study during the last couple of weeks is pretty much the same, which is indicative that there's a fundamental shift in the RF parameters at the end of the study compared to the beginning of the study. And the same is true for the case where we train on the first 10 weeks of data and then test on the last 5 weeks of data. And in this case, we do a better job of reconstructing the data, obviously, between sort of weeks 10 to 15, and then it starts to drift away. And then that offset, again, is consistent across all 4 architectures that we tested. And the really interesting thing about this is that offset in the reconstruction error is consistent across the 2 data sets. So when we trained on the first 5 weeks versus training on the first 10 weeks, we still had the same reconstruction error at the end during the last couple of weeks in both cases. So that's very suggestive that there's something fundamentally different about the RF parameters during the end of the study that versus like what's going on in the beginning of the study. And visually, it looks relatively well correlated with the output in the beam current. From a numerical standpoint, it's a roughly a 10% increase in the correlation coefficient. If you just do a raw correlation between the RF parameters and the beam current, and then you do a correlation of the reconstruction error with the beam current, the reconstruction error is more correlated with the change in beam current than just the raw RF parameters, which is, again, suggestive that there's something fundamental here that is worthy of investigation. So that's something that we're actively working on and looking into. Okay, so the next study is a little bit different. This is trying to understand, can we predict whether or not a magnet's going to fault in the storage ring? And if we can predict if a magnet will fault, do we know which magnet it is that faulted? So this is kind of a complicated problem. There's, like I said, there's quite a few magnets in the storage ring. If you look at the storage ring is broken down into sectors, and there's different types of magnets per sector, and you can say, okay, well, we might want to consider a subset of this data set. And we did that by looking at aggregating over different types of magnets in different sectors, just to simplify the number of inputs. I mean, 1,300 inputs is not a huge amount of data for a machine learning problem, but just fewer inputs is easier to train and simpler. So we wanted to pick a simpler starting point. And this is just to sort of give an example of the kinds of data that we have. So there's what we refer to as reference data, which is essentially just during normal operations, they collect hours and hours of data on the magnet currents, magnet temperatures, and they're just logged at a rate of 1 hertz. And there's just hours of this. And then there's data where a magnet failure occurs. And what happens is the magnet power supply dies, and then the beam gets bumped out of the ring, and you have beam loss, and then you have to basically restart and re-inject the beam. And the idea is to try to figure out if there are precursors to these faults that we can detect by training an autoencoder on reference data and then testing it on data that's neighboring a trip. And we don't actually have the trip inside the data set. So if you look at the test data, a trip does occur in this orange data set, but the minutes leading up to the time that the trip happens is not actually included. So we are really looking at precursors and not biased by the actual trip event itself. And we looked at aggregating over a couple of different parameters. So one of them was aggregating over the sectors. So you reduce it from 1,300 inputs to 80 inputs. And the other one was aggregating by magnet type inside of a sector. So that simplifies down to 300 inputs or so, just to make it a little bit easier to study the problem before we scale up. And when you're aggregating by sector, this is just to get an idea of what the data looks like. It's hard to visualize. And mainly what we're trying to see is there a difference between the test data set, which is where we know there are anomalous data points, and the training data set where there's no anomalies. And there's, on the right-hand side, this plot is just showing the difference in the two histogram plots. And essentially, yes, there is a difference. So it's encouraging that we should, if we train a autoencoder just on the reference data, then the reconstruction error should not be as good for the test data set, which is what we're looking for. We're looking to see that it's an unsupervised learning problem where we're training on known data and then testing it on unknown data and looking for anomalies. So this is just showing the autoencoder performance on the training data. This is actually the validation data. So the validation data, training data are interleaved, but it's all on known good data. And this is the R squared for the fit for each one of the input parameters. And then on the right, you're looking at the autoencoder prediction versus the ground truth for a number of different parameters. And they're stacked on top of each other. There's a few different parameters shown per plot. This is just to show these should be a straight line, and indeed they are all a straight line, and there's very little variance. So we have a nice, well-trained autoencoder. So the next is to, once the autoencoder is trained, you look at the reconstruction error, look at the RMS reconstruction error. There's two different ways that we can flag anomalies. We can try to flag anomalies sector by sector. So maybe that's just looking at the raw reconstruction error, which is in the top right. So there's 80, on the top right, there's 80 different lines that are all overlaid, and you're saying, okay, I want to find the threshold for what is an anomaly. And you can set that threshold based on saying all of the reference data should be non-anomalous. That should all pass the reconstruction test. So the same thing is true if you look at RMS, which is just the single output parameter for the whole data set. And again, you say the threshold should be set such that all of the reference data is flagged as good and none of it's flagged as anomalous, which would be the totally unsupervised way of doing it, where you say, we don't have any idea what anomalous is going to look like. We're just going to set the threshold based on what the reference data says. And then we want to test it on the fault data. So we have known fault data, and we can use this to just verify whether or not this approach is going to work. And you can do this looking at the reconstruction error sector by sector, or you can do this looking at the RMS reconstruction error. And we did both. In the case where we look at the RMS reconstruction error, it correctly identifies 16 out of 26 of the test runs as anomalous. And roughly 8% of all the data in the test set is flagged as faulty. So that's, if you're looking at this, more than 60,000 data points or so per sector, 8% of that is flagged as anomalous, which was a fair amount. So that's encouraging. And then you can vary if you want to do like a semi-supervised approach where we have known anomalies, we can vary the reconstruction threshold and look at the trade-off between the true positive rate versus the false positive rate. So we get our ROC curve, and using both just squared error, which is the sector by sector error, or using RMS error, which is an aggregate effect. And in general, looking at RMS error seems to work better for just identifying whether or not a fault is going to occur. But it's not so good because if you're looking at an aggregate parameter, it's hard to pinpoint exactly which sector it is that's faulting. And that's sort of what this shows. So here we're looking at sector by sector, which one is being flagged as anomalous. And for some of these cases, a very few of them actually, it's clear there's a single sector that's being flagged as anomaly, or there's no sectors that are flagged as anomalous. But for many of them, there's many sectors are being flagged as anomalous, which just indicates that it's going to be very, very difficult to identify exactly which sector is faulting, as opposed to identifying precursors. So when we look at this in time series for each one of the runs, we're saying, okay, at what point in time does the fault become obvious to the autoencoder? And in some of these cases, it's very early on. So in the largest case, we had a prediction window of 1.5 hours before the fault occurred, where we saw that there was a fault based on the reconstruction test failing. So that's actually very encouraging, because there may be a case where you have a user running an experiment and you say, looks like the beam might trip off sometime in the next hour, finish up your experiment, and that it keeps them from being in a situation where it trips off unexpectedly. So that's definitely encouraging. And then we also looked at aggregating by magnet type in the sector. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's essentially the same thing as the previous plot. The previous results is just that we're expanding the data set and trying to compare which approaches work best for which cases. And if we look at so we have temperature data and current data, and this is aggregating. So there's a lot more parameters. This has the 320 parameters. Again, the autoencoder trains very well. And again, looking at RMS error is a better metric for minimizing that false positive rate. But again, with RMS, it's hard to identify the specific magnet type in the sector that faulted. And then when you compare this between looking at temperature data, current data, and current data where we aggregate by sector, the false positive rate is the lowest for the temperature data where we aggregate by magnet type in the sector. So that's saying that we should be using the bigger data set just in general to minimize that false positive rate. So that's pretty much it. The summary is that we've done some analysis of autoencoders looking at RF parameters inside of our LINAC at Fermilab. And also we're continuing to work on using autoencoders for anomaly detection to identify precursors for magnet faults in the APS storage ring. And a lot of this work is ongoing, still trying to look at other things, look at sort of LSTMs is one of the options for actually trying to predict at what time the magnet will fault. And thank you for your attention.